The smell hit City Z before the sound did. Not smoke. City Z always smelled a little like smoke, like scorched asphalt and old fry oil and whatever the last monster attack had cooked on its way through. This was different. Ozone and something sweeter underneath it, like the air itself had been peeled back and something colder was breathing through the gap. Genos noticed it first. He always did. He was 3 blocks from the noodle stand when his internal sensors flagged an energy signature that didn't belong on any chart he carried. And Genos carried a lot of charts. Dragon-level anomalies had a signature. God-level threats, the handful ever logged, had a signature too, jagged and violent, like a wound in the readings. This wasn't jagged. This was smooth, contained. A power source so far past the ceiling of his instruments that the needle didn't spike, it just quietly gave up and sat there, humming at a number that made no sense. He picked up his pace. The noodle stand belonged to a man named Oda, who'd been running it out of a repurposed shipping container on the corner of 3rd and Vine for 6 years. Through 2 monster rampages, 1 building collapse 2 streets over, and a rat problem he still hadn't fully solved. Oda had broth simmering, noodles portioned, and a regular customer base of exactly the kind of unglamorous City Z locals who never made it into a hero's origin story. Cab drivers, night shift security guards, an old woman named Reiko who came every Tuesday and complained about the salt. None of them had ever served a god before. None of them clocked it now either. He'd arrived the way he always did. Not a flash, not a boom, just a shift in the air like a page turning, and then he was simply there, sitting on the stool at the end of the counter like he'd been sitting on it his whole life. Purple skin, cat eyes, a dark red tunic that looked expensive in a way none of the customers could place, gold jewelry that caught the fluorescent light and threw it back sharper than it should have. His tail curled once around the stool leg and went still. "One of everything," he said, not looking at the menu. "Good stuff first." Oda blinked. "We got, miso, shoyu, tonkotsu." I said good stuff. Beerus's eyes flicked up, half-lidded, unbothered. "Not slow stuff." Oda made the tonkotsu. It took him 4 minutes flat, personal record, hands moving faster than they had in years, because something about the customer's stillness made the air in the container feel thinner. He set the bowl down. Beerus looked at it the way a man might look at a parking ticket. He picked up the chopsticks. He tried 1 bite. The silence that followed had weight to it. "This," Beerus said slowly, "is an insult. Aye, sir, that's my best. I didn't ask what it was. I told you what it is." He set the chopsticks down with a precision that was somehow more alarming than if he'd thrown them. "Do you know how many planets I have eaten the last meal of? Do you know how many civilizations spent their final centuries perfecting a recipe worth remembering me by?" He gestured vaguely at the bowl, at the container, at the whole sad little corner of a city he'd never asked to visit. "This is not that. This is nothing." Reiko, 3 stools down, had stopped mid-slurp. The cab driver next to her had gone very quiet in the specific way City Z residents went quiet when their internal monster alert instinct kicked in, the one honed by years of learning that the wrong reaction to the wrong stranger got you on the evening news as a casualty count. Beerus stood. He looked, for a moment, genuinely disappointed. Not angry yet, just tired. The particular fatigue of someone who has crossed an unfathomable distance hoping for something good, and found, again, something forgettable. Then his eyes drifted past the stand to the food truck parked across the street. Seafood bowls, hand-painted, a line of 3 people waiting, and something in his expression sharpened with faint, cruel curiosity. "Let's try that one instead." He raised 1 finger. A single point of light bloomed at the tip, pink-white, small as a coin, and utterly silent. The truck didn't explode. It didn't so much as rattle. It simply came apart from the edges inward, wood and steel and paint dissolving into drifting motes of light like a photograph burning in reverse, gone in under 2 seconds, gone so completely that the 3 people in line stood there for a full breath, staring at empty pavement before any of them found the nerve to scream. That was when Genos rounded the corner. He took in the scene in a tenth of a second. The erased truck, the screaming line, the stillness of the man on the stool radiating a power reading his sensors were still refusing to properly render, and made the only decision his combat protocols offered him. "Identify yourself," Genos said, forearms already reconfiguring, panel seams glowing faint orange as his incinerator cannons primed. Unauthorized use of an unregistered ability resulting in property destruction is a Class A violation under Hero Association Civilian Protection Code. "Stand down." Beerus turned his head, unhurried, and looked at the cyborg the way a man looks at a fly that's landed somewhere inconvenient. "You're a robot," he observed. "Cyborg," Genos corrected, cannons winding up to charge. "Disciple of Saitama. Last warning. Saitama." Beerus tasted the name like he'd tasted the noodles, and found it similarly wanting. Then something shifted behind his eyes. Not recognition, not yet, but the first flicker of a god remembering that a universe this size, however unimpressive its cuisine, might still contain something worth his attention. "That's a name. Names mean something happened to earn them. What happened? I'm not here to answer questions. I'm here to neutralize a threat." Genos's voice stayed level, procedural, even as every sensor screaming that his readings couldn't possibly be right. "This is your final warning. Stand down or engage." Beerus smiled. It did not reach his eyes, and it was worse for it. "Engage, then." Genos fired. Twin streams of incinerator flame roared across the street. Full output, the kind of blast that had leveled monster cell mutations twice his own size, the kind of heat that turned asphalt to glass. It struck Beerus dead center, and did nothing. Not nothing like it missed. It connected, the fire wrapped around him fully, and for one suspended second, the whole street was lit orange and the noise was a physical wall of sound. Then it guttered out against skin that hadn't so much as reddened, hadn't shifted a single fold of the tunic, hadn't disturbed one hair. Beerus hadn't moved. He hadn't even bothered to raise a hand. "Is that all?" he said. Not a question, a verdict. Genos processed the result in the half-second his systems needed and made the second decision his combat protocols offered, which was to escalate to full incineration mode, every cannon at maximum, a barrage designed to overwhelm anything short of a God-classified entity through sheer accumulated output. He'd used it exactly 4 times in his operational history. Each time, it had ended the fight. He used it now. The street became a furnace. Windows 2 blocks down cracked from the heat differential. Oda had already dragged Reiko behind the counter, both of them pressed flat, as the world outside turned into rolling orange light and a sound like the sky tearing. When it cleared, Beerus was picking a fleck of ash off his sleeve with visible distaste. "You're better than the noodles," he said, "but that's not saying much." Genos's targeting systems flagged something his combat logic hadn't been built to process cleanly. Total damage output, 0 effect. Opponent unprovoked to counterattack, despite having every opportunity. This wasn't a fight. This was a demonstration, and Genos was the visual aid. He didn't retreat. Retreat wasn't in the calculus his master had built him around, but he did, for the first time in longer than he could recall, run a threat assessment loop that returned no viable strategy, not insufficient output, which he'd logged before, but a flat, structural "there is no version of this I can win." "I am filing an emergency hero association alert," Genos said, voice steady despite it. "Classification pending. You will be met with appropriate response." "Good." Beerus's tail flicked, almost pleased. "Send your best. If this world has anything worth the trip, I'd like to know before I leave." The call reached Hero Association Dispatch 4 minutes later, and the officer who took it, a heavy-set, permanently rumpled man named Sitch, 22 years into a job that had long since stopped surprising him, read the incident report twice before he trusted himself to speak into the comm. "Say that again. Full incineration mode, S-class cyborg output, zero effect," Genos's voice repeated, clipped and precise even now. "Requesting immediate God classification review and executive dispatch." Sitch looked at the readout on his monitor, the raw energy signature Genos had managed to capture before his sensors briefly locked up trying to parse it, and felt something cold settle behind his sternum. City Z's board had exactly one classification above Dragon, added after the Monster Association fell, and someone in Hero Association leadership had finally admitted, on paper, that the ceiling wasn't where they'd thought it was. It had never been formally used. It had existed until this exact moment as a hypothetical box on a form nobody expected to check. He checked it. "Alerting executive tier," he said into the comm, hands not quite steady. "God class incident, City Z, requesting full response protocol." He paused, staring at the readout like it might change if he looked hard enough. It didn't. "And somebody wake up King. Somebody wake up everybody." 3 floors up, in an office that hadn't seen this particular alert light up in the entire time it had existed, a monitor blinked red for the first time in Hero Association history, and a very tired administrative system began the process of calling in every S-class hero within response range, while 4 blocks from a smoking hole where a seafood truck used to be, a god sat on a stool, tail curled patiently around its leg, and waited to see if this world had anything worth his time at all. The response protocol for a God-class incident had exactly one prior draft, written by a committee that never expected to use it, and it fell apart within 11 minutes of actual deployment. The plan called for containment perimeter, then evaluation, then, if evaluation confirmed hostile intent, a graduated response starting with the highest-ranked available Class S hero and escalating from there. What it did not account for was Tatsumaki arriving first, unannounced, uninterested in perimeters, because she'd heard God Class over the emergency band while she was already 3 miles out investigating an unrelated psychic disturbance and decided the paperwork could wait. She dropped out of the sky over 3rd and Vine in a slow, contemptuous spiral, arms crossed, green hair whipping in a wind that wasn't blowing anywhere else, and looked down at the crater where a seafood truck used to be, then at the purple-skinned stranger sitting on a stool outside a noodle stand like he was waiting for a bus. "You," she said, "are the God class reading." "I'm several things," Beerus said, not looking up. "Which one upset you?" Tatsumaki's eyes narrowed. She'd fought things that broke reality's rules before. Monster Association nightmares. Things that shouldn't have had names. A dragon-level horror made of teeth and bad geometry that still showed up in her worst dreams. She'd never once, in the entirety of her career, looked at something and felt her own power register as small. It happened now, a flicker, gone almost as fast as it arrived, and it made her furious in the specific way that only genuine fear could produce in her. She didn't waste time on words after that. She reached out with her mind instead, and the street answered, asphalt tearing itself up in slabs, a delivery van crumpling and launching, a lamppost ripping free of its concrete base, all of it converging on Beerus in a single crushing wave of raw telekinetic force, the kind of attack that had turned dragon-level monsters into modern art. It stopped 4 feet from him and hung there, suspended, humming with all that violent potential and doing exactly nothing. Beerus glanced at the frozen wreckage with mild interest, the way a man might glance at a magic trick he already knew the mechanism of. "That's clever," he said. "Mind over matter. Cute trick." He raised one finger almost lazily, and the entire suspended mass of wreckage, van, lamppost, torn asphalt, 6 years of Tatsumaki's hard-earned reputation as an unstoppable force, dissolved into drifting light and was gone. For the second time in 10 minutes, the street went very quiet. Tatsumaki's hands were shaking. Not from exertion, she'd barely spent anything, but from the singular experience of having her power, the thing she'd built her entire identity around since childhood, simply erased from the equation like it had never been relevant to begin with. "What are you?" she said, and for once it wasn't a demand. It was close to a genuine question. Beerus. He said it like a courtesy, because in the grand scheme he supposed she'd earned that much. "God of destruction. I judge things. Mostly I've been judging your noodles, but you're a reasonable second course." His tail flicked. "You're not bad, by the way." For here. Something in her cracked wide open. Not fear anymore, just pure incandescent fury at being patronized by something she couldn't even scratch. She rose higher, hair lifting, the air around her crackling with the kind of pressure that had, on prior occasions, brought buildings down. "I am the strongest Esper alive." "You might be." Beerus finally stood, unhurried, dusting invisible dust from his tunic. "In this little box of a universe, you might be exactly that. It's not a small thing, being the strongest something. I just hate for you to mistake it for being strong." He didn't attack her. That was somehow the worst part. He simply looked bored, like the conversation had reached its natural end, and turned his attention back toward the noodle stand's ruined storefront, as if Tatsumaki had already stopped being relevant to his afternoon. She didn't take the dismissal well. Few S-class heroes would have. She came at him with everything, no more testing, no more restraint. City Z's skyline groaned as she ripped 3 surrounding structures apart and hurled the debris in a converging storm meant to bury him under sheer overwhelming mass, meant to at minimum force a reaction, force him to notice. He caught the entire storm with one raised palm and held it there, suspended mid-collapse, buildings and steel and glass hanging frozen in the air around him like a diorama, and looked at her with something that had finally sharpened past boredom into actual attention. "There," he said. "That's a little better." Then he closed his hand. The wreckage didn't dissolve this time. Simply stopped existing, all of it, an entire block's worth of debris gone in the space between one heartbeat and the next, leaving nothing but settling dust, and a silence so total that 3 streets over, Sitch's emergency comm line went eerily, dangerously quiet, as every sensor in the vicinity briefly failed to register anything at all. Tatsumaki hung in the air, breathing hard, and for the first time in her adult life didn't know what came next. "You're wasting your good moves being angry," Beerus said, almost gently, almost like advice. "Try being interesting instead." King arrived 4 minutes later, because King always arrived eventually, and because the Hero Association's protocol demanded the highest-ranked hero present make contact regardless of what his own instincts were screaming. His instincts, for the record, were screaming plenty. He stood at the mouth of the ruined street, capes settling around his shoulders, taking in Tatsumaki hovering rigid and silent, the crater where a truck had been, the strange purple figure standing amid it all with the unbothered posture of a man waiting for a table. King's reputation, undefeated, unshaken, the strongest hero alive by the association's own official record, had survived exactly by never once having to test itself against anything real. He understood better than almost anyone alive the difference between a reputation and a truth, and every fiber of the truth in him was currently insisting that this was the day the two finally collided. He didn't run. He'd never learned how to, not physically, but something in his chest, cold and old and honest, informed him plainly that running wouldn't have mattered anyway. "That's new," Beerus said, turning to look at him, and something about his expression shifted. Not more alert, exactly, but curious in a different register, like a man who'd been idly flipping through a book and found a page with actual weight to it. "You're not like her." He nodded toward Tatsumaki without looking at her. "She's loud. You're not. What are you?" King said nothing. His mouth had gone dry. Beerus tilted his head, studying him with unsettling patience. "There's something underneath that. Something you're not showing." A pause, longer this time, and for one suspended moment the god of destruction looked, almost, intrigued rather than bored. Or maybe there isn't, and you're just very good at looking like there is. I've met both kinds before. Hard to tell yet which one you are. Behind Beerus, unnoticed, Genos had crept back into range with 3 additional Hero Association response units, weapons drawn, sensors screaming, waiting on a single word from King that never came. Because King, for the first time in the entire history of his impossible reputation, genuinely did not know what to say. The silence stretched. Somewhere in it, the god of destruction seemed to reach a decision. "I'm bored of this street," Beerus announced, glancing around at the wreckage with faint distaste, like it had personally offended him by being unimpressive rubble instead of something worth his time. "Whoever runs this place, whoever's actually in charge of judging threats and handing out those little classification numbers I keep hearing whispered about, send them. Properly. Not 4 minutes at a time. I want the whole conversation, not the appetizer." "There's no one in charge you can just summon," Genos said, stepping forward despite every readout telling him not to. "The Hero Association operates on classification and response protocol, not audience with executives." "Then your protocol just changed." Beerus's tail curled once, patient, final. "I'll give this city until sundown to bring me someone worth the conversation. After that," he shrugged, easy, terrible in its casualness, "I start judging on my own terms. And I promise you my terms are considerably less patient than 4 minutes and a bowl of bad noodles." He sat back down on the one surviving stool amid the wreckage, folded his arms, and closed his eyes like a man settling in for a nap he'd more than earned. Nobody moved. Nobody, for several long seconds, breathed. 3 blocks away, in an apartment that hadn't been swept for a week and smelled faintly of instant noodles gone slightly stale, Saitama sat on the floor in his boxers, controller in hand, 3 lives deep into a fighting game he'd already beaten twice, when the building shook for the 4th time that hour, and he finally, mildly, glanced toward the window. "Another one?" He asked no one in particular. He didn't get up yet. City Z rattled with something new almost daily now, and 90% of the time it resolved itself before he finished a game round, courtesy of whichever S-class hero happened to be closest. He paused the game instead, scratched the back of his bald head, and considered, with the profound lack of urgency that had come to define most of his life, whether this was actually worth putting pants on for. Then his phone buzzed. Genos. Genos never called during the day unless it mattered. He looked at the screen for a second, sighed, and reached for his hero costume folded neatly on the floor beside him. "Guess I'm putting pants on," he muttered, and started to get dressed, unhurried, unimpressed. The single most dangerous thing in the entire story finally, slowly, beginning to move. Back at the crater, Sitch's voice crackled through King's earpiece, tight with a strain that hadn't been there an hour ago. "Executive Board is convening. They want a stall, someone to hold him until we can put together an actual response, not just throw S-Class at him one at a time and hope." "King, you're the highest rank on site. Can you hold the line?" King looked at the god of destruction, sitting placid amid the wreckage of a street that 3 of the strongest people alive had failed to leave a mark on, and understood with total clarity that holding the line was a phrase that had simply stopped meaning anything today. "I can try," he said, because it was the only honest thing left to say, and because somewhere down the block, unhurried and unbothered, a bald man in a yellow suit had just stepped out of his apartment and started walking toward the noise. Not fast, not urgent, just walking, the way he always did, toward the one fight in the entire city that had actually, finally, sounded like it might be worth the trip. By the time Saitama reached the crater, sundown was still hours off, but the mood on the street had already curdled into something closer to a funeral. 3 additional S-Class heroes had arrived in the interim. Metal Knight's drone contingent hovering at a cautious distance, weapons trained and doing nothing useful. Zombie Man standing near the perimeter with the flat patience of a man who'd died enough times to stop being afraid of dying again, which made him useful for exactly one thing today: staying close enough to witness, far enough to survive being an afterthought. Bang had arrived too, older joints protesting the pace, martial arts stance settled, but his eyes doing the math on an opponent his instincts told him no stance would help against. None of them had engaged again. Word had spread fast. Tatsumaki's telekinesis erased midair, King's reputation reduced to silence, an entire block's worth of debris blinked out of existence like a light switching off. The Hero Association's response protocol, built over years to handle everything from street-level thugs to dragon-class monsters, had quietly run out of next steps. What remained was containment, waiting, and the growing unspoken understanding that containment was a word being used to dress up nothing we can do. Beerus hadn't moved from his stool. He'd taken to idly examining his own claws, tail flicking with the particular restlessness of someone who'd been promised entertainment and was still waiting on delivery. "This is worse than the noodles," he announced to no one, and I didn't think that was possible. That was when Saitama arrived. He didn't announce himself. He didn't need to. The crowd of heroes at the perimeter parted the way crowds always did around him, half out of protocol, half out of the specific reflexive deference that came from having watched this particular man walk through the worst things City Z had to offer without breaking stride. He had his hands in his pockets. His cape moved a little in the wind. He looked, more than anything, like a man who'd been pulled away from a video game he was mildly annoyed about pausing. "Somebody said God class," Saitama said, stopping a few yards from the wreckage, glancing around at the crater, the drones, King's uncharacteristically rigid posture. "This it?" Genos moved to his side immediately, voice low, urgent in the controlled way that meant he was working very hard not to sound as alarmed as his systems actually were. Sensei, full incineration mode, had zero effect. Tatsumaki's telekinesis was neutralized entirely. His power output doesn't register on any scale we have. I'd advise extreme. Yeah, okay. Saitama was already walking past him. Beerus's eyes opened at the movement. Not fast, not alarmed, just the unhurried attention of something ancient, noticing a new variable enter the room. He looked Saitama over. The plain face, the unremarkable posture, the total absence of the tension every other person on this street was radiating. "You're late," Beerus said, was in the middle of something. Saitama stopped a few feet away, hands still in his pockets, looking at the crater, the dissolved debris, the general mood of a street that had clearly had a very bad afternoon. "You do all this?" "Some of it. The rest did itself trying to stop me." Beerus tilted his head, something in his expression shifting into real curiosity for the first time all day. Not the flicker he'd shown King, but something closer to actual interest. "You don't look worried." "Should I be?" "Everyone else is." Saitama shrugged, the particular shrug of a man who genuinely, structurally, did not have the capacity for the emotion being discussed. "I don't know what you are, but somebody's got to tell you to knock it off, and everybody else looks kind of busy standing there." Something about that, the flatness of it, the total absence of posturing, no speech about heroism, no declaration, just a bald man in a cheap costume stating a chore like he was mentioning the trash needed taking out, made Beerus sit up a little straighter on his stool, tail going still. "You know what I am?" "Nope." "I could unmake this entire city in the time it takes you to blink." "Probably shouldn't do that." "That's your argument?" "I don't really do arguments." Saitama scratched the back of his head, looking faintly bored himself now, an echo of Beerus's own expression from an hour earlier, though neither of them seemed to register the irony. "I do the other thing," Beerus laughed, a short, genuinely surprised sound, the first unguarded thing he'd done since arriving. "I like you. You're either the bravest thing I've met all week or the single dumbest." He stood, unhurried, tunic settling, tail curling once behind him. "Let's find out which." He raised one hand, casual, almost polite about it, the same gesture that had erased a food truck, absorbed an incinerator barrage, dissolved a city block, and a sphere of pink-white destruction energy bloomed at his palm, small at first, then swelling, fast, into something with genuine mass and weight, something the air itself seemed to bend away from. Every hero on the perimeter felt it in their teeth. King's knees actually buckled slightly, catching himself against a fallen slab of concrete. Genos's sensors screamed a number that didn't fit any register they'd been built to display. Beerus hurled it. It crossed the distance in a heartbeat, a compressed, silent wave of annihilation aimed squarely at the one man on the street who hadn't so much as tensed his shoulders. Saitama threw a punch. It wasn't dramatic. It never was. No wind-up, no shout, no gathering of energy, just a fist moving forward at a speed that made the air scream, connecting with the sphere of god-tier destruction energy at the exact midpoint between them, and for one fractional instant the entire block was lit in a violent flash of pink and white and something that had no color name at all. And then it was just quiet. The energy was gone, not deflected, not absorbed, simply unmade, the way Beerus had been unmaking things all day, except this time it had happened to him, and Saitama was still standing there with his fist extended and his expression completely, totally unchanged. "Huh," Saitama said, looking at his own hand like it had done something mildly interesting. That one had a little more kick than usual. The silence that followed was the loudest thing that had happened on that street all day. Beerus stood very still. Something in his face, the boredom, the casual disdain that had defined every second since he'd sat down at that noodle stand, had drained away entirely, replaced by an expression none of the watching heroes had a name for, because none of them had ever seen it on him before. Genuine, uncomplicated shock. "That," Beerus said slowly, "should not have worked. Sorry, wasn't really trying to make a point." Saitama lowered his hand, glancing around at the wreckage again, at the tense faces of every hero still frozen at the perimeter. "You gonna keep going, or are we done? Kinda wanna get back before my game autosaves in a bad spot." For the first time since arriving in this universe, Beerus didn't have an immediate answer. What happened next didn't look like a fight. It looked, to the handful of heroes watching from a safe distance, more like a physicist running increasingly desperate versions of the same experiment. Beerus struck again, faster this time, a full-speed strike aimed to test reflex rather than raw output, the kind of movement that would have been invisible to any Class S hero on the perimeter. Saitama caught his wrist without appearing to have moved at all, like he'd simply always been holding it. "You're strong," Saitama said, sounding genuinely a little pleased about it. In the mild way he sounded pleased about anything. First guy in a while who didn't just, immediately explode. Explode! Beerus's voice had gone quiet, and quiet on him was somehow more unsettling than the destruction sphere had been. He pulled his wrist free. Saitama let him, and took a step back, tail lashing once, sharp. "Do you understand what you are describing? I have erased galaxies. I felled gods before your species learned to walk upright. I am not a threat classification on some clipboard. I am the reason threat classifications exist." "Cool." Saitama nodded, unbothered, hands going back into his pockets. "You want food or something? There's a decent place 2 blocks over. Better than whatever you tried here." The heroes at the perimeter, Genos included, sensors still struggling to reconcile what they'd just witnessed, watched the god of destruction stand frozen for a long moment, staring at a bald man who had just casually deflected the single most devastating attack the universe had ever produced, and then invited him to lunch as though nothing remarkable had happened at all. Something in Beerus's posture shifted. The predatory stillness drained out of it, replaced, slowly, by something almost like curiosity reborn. Sharper this time, less bored, genuinely engaged for what might have been the first time in centuries. "You're not lying," Beerus said, mostly to himself. "You're not posturing. You actually don't care. Not really my thing." Saitama shrugged again. Caring gets exhausting. "You want to throw more of those energy balls, or should we go eat?" King, watching from the perimeter, felt something in his chest finally unclench. The specific, disorienting relief of watching a reputation he'd spent years faking suddenly, unexpectedly, become someone else's problem to live up to instead. Beside him, Tatsumaki hovered rigid, arms still crossed, staring at Saitama with an expression that was equal parts fury and something that looked almost like the beginning of respect, though she'd have died before admitting it. Genos allowed himself, for the first time since the incident began, a single exhale. Beerus, for his part, looked at Saitama for a long moment, weighing something, some private calculus that had nothing to do with power levels and everything to do with the strange, rare experience of genuine surprise, and then, slowly, the corner of his mouth twitched into something that wasn't quite a smile, but wasn't far off either. "Fine," he said. "Show me this place. But if the food's bad again, I'm starting over with the whole city, and this time I won't ask nicely first." "Deal." Saitama started walking, unhurried as ever, like he hadn't just quietly rewritten the terms of an encounter every S-class hero on the perimeter would be talking about for the rest of their careers. Behind them, Sitch's voice crackled weakly through King's earpiece, the words coming slower than usual, like a man reading a script he no longer trusted. Status update. Do we have containment? King looked at the two figures walking away down a wrecked street, side by side, one god and one man who'd made a god flinch, and found, to his own quiet surprise, that he almost wanted to laugh. "No," King said. "I don't think containment is the word for what just happened. I think we just got a lunch invitation." The place Saitama had in mind was a ramen shop 2 streets over, chosen entirely because it hadn't been demolished yet, though after the day the neighborhood had, that felt more like an oversight than an achievement. It was small, family-run, with steam fogging the windows and an owner named Handa who took one look at the small procession trailing in behind Saitama, a purple-skinned stranger, a scorched cyborg, a green-haired Esper still radiating quiet fury, and King, who looked like he hadn't slept in a decade, and decided, with the wisdom of a man who'd survived multiple monster incursions, not to ask a single question. Beerus sat. He ordered without looking at the menu, the same way he had at the noodle stand, but this time there was no immediate contempt in it, just watchfulness, weighing the room the way he'd weighed Saitama's punch, waiting to see if the universe had anything left to surprise him with. The bowl arrived. He tried it. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Genos, standing rigid near the door because some part of him still hadn't fully stood down from combat readiness, watched the god of destruction's expression shift through something unreadable before settling, finally, into grudging approval. "Better," Beerus said. "Not perfect, but better." "Told you," Saitama said, already most of the way through his own bowl. Tatsumaki had taken a seat as far from Beerus as the small shop allowed, arms crossed, glaring at the table like it had personally wronged her. She hadn't said a word since the crater. King sat beside her, posture carefully neutral, the specific stillness of a man trying very hard not to be noticed by something that had already erased a truck for the crime of being underwhelming. It was Genos who finally broke the silence, because someone had to, and because his programming for information gathering hadn't fully switched off despite everything. "You said you judge things," he said carefully. "Is that why you came here? To judge our world?" Beerus considered the question with the same unhurried attention he'd given the noodles. "I judge what's worth existing and what isn't. Usually planets. Occasionally civilizations, if they've done something interesting enough to earn a look." He gestured vaguely with his chopsticks, taking in the shop, the street outside, the whole strange little pocket of a universe he'd stumbled into. "This place is small, contained. Your strongest," a nod toward Saitama, unbothered, still eating, "is stronger than he has any right to be. And everyone around him seems to have collectively decided not to make a big deal of it, which is, honestly, the most interesting thing about the whole visit." "So what's the verdict?" Genos asked, and the question landed heavier than he meant it to, because everyone else at the table had gone very still waiting on the answer. Beerus didn't respond immediately. He set his chopsticks down, tail curling loosely around the leg of his stool, and for a moment looked less like a god weighing a planet's fate and more like a tired traveler deciding whether a stop was worth extending. "I haven't decided," he said finally. "That's the honest answer. Most places I visit, the decision makes itself. Either they're worth remembering or they're not, and it's rarely close." His eyes flicked toward Saitama again, lingering there in a way that was almost, for a being like him, uncomfortably close to respect. "This one's close." That's not exactly reassuring, King said quietly, the first thing he'd said since sitting down. It's not meant to be. Beerus's gaze slid to him, and something about the attention made King's spine go rigid, despite his best efforts. You, the quiet one. You've got layers I can't get a clean read on, and I don't like that. I don't like things I can't get a clean read on. I'm just a hero, King said, and it came out steadier than he felt. Everyone's just something, right up until they aren't. Beerus's tail flicked, and he turned his attention away, apparently satisfied with whatever half-answer he'd extracted, though the exchange left King quietly, thoroughly unsettled in a way none of the day's actual combat had managed. The Hero Association's executive board convened an emergency session 40 minutes later in a conference room 3 floors above Sitch's dispatch desk, and it did not go well. 7 executives sat around a table that had, until today, mostly hosted budget disputes and PR damage control after messier monster incidents. Now it hosted a live feed from Genos' ocular sensors, replaying the moment Saitama's fist had unmade a sphere of destruction energy that should have, by every metric the association possessed, erased the entire eastern half of the city. "We have no framework for this," said the board chair, a sharp-eyed woman named Aizawa, who'd built her career on precisely calibrated responses to precisely calibrated threats. "Every classification we have assumes the threat can eventually be matched, contained, or worn down. This," she gestured at the frozen frame of Beerus's raised hand, "doesn't fit any of those assumptions, and the only reason we're not currently mourning half our roster is because Saitama happened to be in a video game he could pause." "Then the obvious answer is to formally attach him to God-class response protocol," said another executive, a heavy-set man near the end of the table. "Make it official. Standing deployment, first response, no delay." "He doesn't respond to protocol," Aizawa said flatly. "He responds to whether he feels like getting up. We've built an entire organizational structure on the assumption that heroism can be organized, ranked, and dispatched. Today proved that the only thing standing between this city and total annihilation was a man's attention span, and that is not something you can put in a policy document." The room went quiet with the particular discomfort of people confronting a truth they'd spent years successfully avoiding. "What about the visitor himself?" said a younger executive near the back, the one who'd been quietly monitoring live sensor data throughout the meeting. "Do we have any read on intent? Is he leaving? Staying? Are we about to have a permanent God-class resident?" Nobody had an answer, because the honest answer was that a being capable of unmaking their entire response force in an afternoon was, at that very moment, eating ramen 2 streets from their headquarters and had not, to anyone's knowledge, informed a single official body of his actual plans. "Get Sitch on comms with the field team," Aizawa said finally, rubbing her temples. "I want eyes on him at all times, and I want to know the second he shows any sign of leaving, or any sign that he's decided to stay." Back at the ramen shop, the meal had wound down into something almost absurdly companionable. Tatsumaki had said maybe 6 words the entire time, most of them to the waitress. King had eaten in careful, measured bites, the posture of a man trying not to draw attention back to himself. Genos had positioned himself near enough to intervene and far enough to look like he wasn't preparing to, a compromise that fooled no one. Beerus, for his part, had relaxed by degrees over the course of the meal in a way that felt, to everyone watching, more unsettling than his earlier hostility had been, because a bored god was predictable and a satisfied one was not. "I have a question," he said eventually, setting down his empty bowl, addressing Saitama directly. Why do you do this? The fighting, the heroics. You clearly don't need the recognition. I watched you not care about a single thing that happened today, including the part where I nearly erased a city block. So why bother? Saitama thought about it for a moment. Genuinely thought, which was rarer than his usual immediate answers suggested. Dunno, started 'cause I wanted to be strong, kept going 'cause I guess it's just what I do now. Somebody's gotta, and everyone else looks busy. That's not an answer. That's an absence of one. Yeah, probably. Saitama shrugged, unbothered by the observation. Not everything's gotta have a big reason behind it. Beerus studied him for a long moment, tail flicking once, and something in his expression, unreadable to everyone else at the table, but present nonetheless, settled into a decision he hadn't fully voiced yet. I've judged worlds for less interesting reasons than that, he said finally, standing, tunic settling around him. I think I'll stay a while longer, see what else this place has in it. His eyes swept the table, lingering briefly on King, on Tatsumaki, on Genos, before returning to Saitama. You've bought yourselves some time. I wouldn't get comfortable, though. I get bored easily, and boredom's usually when I remember why I came here in the first place. He turned and walked out of the shop without paying, without a backward glance, tail trailing behind him, leaving 4 of the Hero Association's most capable people sitting in stunned, uncertain silence, because a god who'd decided to stay, on his own terms, answerable to no protocol and no classification, was in some ways a far more dangerous proposition than the one who'd simply wanted to leave. Well, Genos said finally, breaking the silence, that could have gone worse. Could it? Tatsumaki muttered, glaring at the door Beerus had disappeared through. Saitama, for his part, was already signaling the waitress for a second bowl, entirely unbothered by the fact that the fate of the city, and possibly the universe, now hinged on how long a bored god's patience would last. I'm getting seconds, he said. Anybody want anything? Nobody answered. Somewhere above them, in a conference room that had run entirely out of protocol, the Hero Association's executive board was quietly, desperately trying to figure out how to write a policy for a threat that had just decided, unilaterally, to become a permanent fixture of their world, and had done it over a bowl of ramen, without once raising his voice. A monster attacked that evening, and in hindsight, everyone would agree it had terrible timing. It wasn't dragon level, not officially. A lingering monster association cell, one of the fragmented remnants that had scattered after the organization's collapse, had spent months rebuilding in the sewers beneath the industrial district, mutating itself in secret with whatever House of Evolution research scraps it could scavenge. It called itself Rend, and it had chosen this particular evening, of all evenings, to finally emerge and make its bid for relevance. A 12-foot mass of fused muscle and bone blades, screaming out of a collapsed storm drain 3 blocks from the ramen shop, apparently unaware that the god of destruction was currently sitting on a nearby rooftop, picking at a skewer of grilled meat he'd bought from a street vendor, watching the city with the patient curiosity of a man auditing a play he wasn't sure was worth the ticket price. Ren didn't know that. Ren just wanted a body count. It got 3 blocks of screaming pedestrians and a very fast Hero Association mobilization before it got anything else. Genos arriving first. Cannons already hot. Tatsumaki descending a moment later with her arms crossed and an expression that suggested she was taking this fight personally after the day she'd had. King arrived too, because protocol demanded the top-ranked hero respond regardless of what his instincts insisted, and stood at the edge of the engagement with the specific stillness of a man who had for once genuinely nothing useful to contribute and knew it. Beerus watched from the rooftop, unmoving, skewer forgotten in his hand. The fight was ugly and real in a way the earlier confrontation hadn't been. Rend was fast, adaptive, throwing bone blade projectiles that Genos had to burn out of the air one by one, forcing Tatsumaki into close-quarters telekinetic grappling that left gouges in the surrounding buildings. It wasn't a demonstration. It was a fight two people were genuinely uncomfortably close to losing. Sweat and blood and the specific fear that came from facing something that could actually hurt you. Beerus watched it unfold with something that looked, for the first time all day, like genuine interest rather than detached amusement. "There it is," he murmured to no one. Ren caught Tatsumaki with a glancing blade strike across the shoulder. Not fatal, but enough to draw blood. Enough to knock the wind and the arrogance both out of her in the same instant. And for a heartbeat, the fight tipped visibly toward disaster. Genos moved to cover her, cannons overheating, systems flashing warnings he chose to ignore. King finally stepped forward too, not because he had a plan, but because standing still while people who'd earned their strength honestly bled in front of him had apparently become, in this one specific moment, unbearable. That was when Beerus stood up on the rooftop, not to intervene. He made that clear with the first thing he said, voice carrying easily across the distance despite never being raised. "Don't," he called down, almost lazily, as King's foot left the ledge he'd been braced against. "This one's not mine to finish. Watch." And so, agonizingly, he did. Tatsumaki dragged herself upright through sheer will, blood running down her arm, and reached for her power one more time. Not the contemptuous, casual force she'd thrown at Beerus earlier, but something rawer, something that actually cost her something to summon. The surrounding wreckage answered, torn free and hurled with precision this time instead of overwhelming volume, aimed with the specific accuracy of someone who'd stopped trying to prove a point and started trying to win a fight. It caught Rend mid-lunge, pinning one arm, buying Genos the half-second he needed to land a full incinerator blast directly into the exposed, mutation-weakened joint at the creature's shoulder. Ren screamed, staggered, and King, finally, uselessly but present, stepped into the gap and threw the single hardest punch of his entire career, more out of sheer refusal to keep standing there doing nothing than any real confidence it would land clean. It did. Not because it was devastating, because it was exactly enough, exactly when it needed to be, against an opponent already broken open by two heroes who'd actually earned the moment. Rend went down and didn't get back up. The street went quiet except for sirens in the distance and Tatsumaki's ragged breathing. Genos moved immediately to check on her, sensors already cataloging the wound, voice pitched low with something that wasn't quite worry but was close enough. King stood over the fallen creature, chest heaving, staring at his own fist like it belonged to someone else. On the rooftop, Beerus finished his skewer. He found them 20 minutes later, once the cleanup crews had arrived and Tatsumaki had grudgingly allowed a medic to bandage her shoulder while insisting, loudly, that it was nothing. He dropped down from the rooftop without fanfare, landing lightly beside the wreckage, and looked at the three of them, battered, bloodied in Tatsumaki's case, quietly proud in a way none of them would have admitted out loud, with an expression that had shed every trace of the boredom he'd walked in with that morning. "That," he said, "was worth the trip." "You could have helped," Tatsumaki snapped, wincing as the medic tightened a bandage. "I could have. I didn't need to." Beerus crouched slightly, studying the fallen creature's corpse with clinical interest before straightening again. "You didn't need me to either." That's the part that mattered. His tail flicked, something almost approving in it. "I've watched a lot of worlds handle their own monsters. Most of them either can't, or they cheat. Bring in something bigger to solve it for them. Call it a win. Forget the difference. You didn't cheat. You just got hurt and kept going anyway. Genos, still monitoring Tatsumaki's vitals despite her protests, glanced up. Is that your judgment, then, of our world? Part of it. Beerus looked past them, toward the skyline, toward the general chaotic, scorched, stubbornly surviving shape of City Z under the darkening evening sky. I still haven't decided the rest. That's the honest truth. I came here hungry and unimpressed, and I'm leaving considerably less hungry and only about half as unimpressed, which for me is practically a rave review. So you're leaving, King said, and something in his voice, careful, hopeful, not quite trusting it yet, made Beerus's mouth twitch toward something like amusement again. For now, Beerus's form began to blur faintly at the edges, that same page-turning shift in the air that had announced his arrival hours earlier. I don't make promises about staying gone. Worlds like this, small, stubborn, occasionally surprising, tend to earn a second look eventually. Especially ones with noodle stands that improve on request. His eyes found Saitama, who'd wandered over from the ramen shop mid-second bowl, apparently unbothered by having missed the entire fight, and especially ones with someone in them who genuinely doesn't care whether I stay or go. That's rarer than you'd think. Across every universe I've bothered to check. Cool, Saitama said, around a mouthful of noodles. Safe travels, I guess. Beerus actually laughed at that. Short, real, entirely unguarded. And it was, everyone would later agree, the strangest sound any of them had heard all day. I'll remember this place, he said, and then, without ceremony, without a flash of light or a dramatic parting line, the air folded around him the way it had folded to bring him here, and he was simply gone, leaving behind a scorched street, a fallen monster, 4 exhausted heroes, and a silence that finally, mercifully, felt like relief instead of dread. Sitch filed the incident report at 11:47 that night and stared at the blank field beside resolution for a long time before finally typing 3 words: voluntary departure, unresolved. It wasn't a satisfying answer. The board wouldn't like it. There'd be meetings for weeks trying to build a protocol for a threat that answered to nothing and no one, that judged worlds the way other beings ordered lunch, that had left not because anyone forced him to, but because he'd simply decided the story was worth remembering and not yet worth finishing. Down in the wreckage of 3rd and Vine, Oda was already sweeping broken glass off his counter, muttering about insurance, already planning the next day's broth. Reiko had come back for her Tuesday bowl a day early, salt complaints fully intact. Life in City Z had a stubborn, undramatic way of resuming itself, the same as it always did, 1 bowl of noodles at a time. 3 blocks away, in an apartment that smelled like instant ramen gone slightly stale, Saitama sat back down on the floor, picked up his controller, and unpaused his game exactly where he'd left it. 1 life down, but still very much in it, the same as always, ready for whatever showed up next.